"This photo is of my friend. Why is it on your wall?" the homeless man asked, his voice barely louder than the wind that skated across the Millionaire's gate. Ricardo stood motionless beneath a span of polished stone and trimmed hedges, the framed photograph on the foyer wall behind him catching the late light. It was a small, ordinary picture. Gabriel's gap-toothed smile, a scuffed soccer ball at his feet, the way his hair refused to stay in place. Ricardo had spent the last 3 months walking past that face as though it were a map to somewhere he could no longer reach. He had not expected anyone to call it by the word that lodged in his throat. "Who are you?" Ricardo asked. The question was polite, but his hands tightened around the gate, as if he could hold back a memory by muscle alone. The homeless man lifted his chin. His clothes were a patchwork of seasons, his cheeks weathered, a thin pack at his feet. He ran a thumb over a faded bracelet on the child's wrist in the photograph, then looked up at Ricardo with a steadiness that surprised both men. "I knew him," he said. He used to sit on the curb and eat the sugar wafers I sold. His name was on a little bracelet. Gabriel." Ricardo blinked. The name landed in the air like a dropped key. For 3 months it had been everything and nothing, an ache without an address. He had watched every channel, hired private investigators, printed flyers, offered rewards. He had transformed the house into a museum of absence. A small bed perfectly made each morning, a nightlight that never went out, a toy train frozen mid-track. The photograph on the wall had become a kind of commandment, a single truth he could still touch. "Show me," Ricardo said before he could measure his hope. The city outside the mansion gate ran on indifferent rhythms, delivery trucks, the distant hum of a subway, a woman arguing on a phone. Yet for Ricardo, the world contracted into the man with the dirty pack and the certainty in his voice. He paid him without thinking, money, contact information, then climbed into his car and followed the homeless man as dusk made the skyline less bright and the streets less forgiving. If Ricardo had been honest with himself, he would have admitted that what drew him forward was not only the fragile possibility of finding Gabriel. He wanted to break the frozen pattern of evenings that had become his life. The way Bruno would sit at the piano and stop mid-phrase, the way his own reflection watched him with someone else's disappointment. There were nights he would stand over his son's bed and press his ear to the pillow, just to remind himself that it was a pillow beneath his palm and not an absence shaped like a child's head. Hope felt dangerous, but it felt better than living as a monument. If this story is grabbing you and you want more true-feeling tales like this, subscribe now. There's more to come.
The homeless man led Ricardo through neighborhoods that seemed to have been forgotten by the city's brighter maps. Storefronts were boarded, a park was dotted with sleeping bags, and the lib of night made faces anonymous. They crossed an overpass and turned into a narrow lane where an old brick building leaned inward like it had a secret. The orphanage stood behind a rusting gate, its paint peeling in long, flaking tears. Someone had once tried to keep things cheerful, handprints painted on a concrete wall, a mural of a sun with a crooked smile. Time and neglect had salted over that attempt. Inside, the air smelled of must and detergent and too little warmth. A woman at a small desk regarded Ricardo with practical suspicion until the homeless man lifted his voice and named the child in the photograph. "My name is Eduardo," he said. "I sold wafers on the corner. Gabriel used to buy them. He had a bracelet." The word bracelet mattered. It mattered because it was small, specific, the kind of thing you did not invent at dinner. It mattered because the bracelet in the photograph was a green plastic band with Gabriel's name written in black marker, a thing that made the face in the frame an actual person and not a statistic. They were led through narrow corridors lined with bunks and second-hand clothes. Children glanced up, curious and cautious, then returned to their games. At the end of a corridor, in a tiny room that might have once been an office, a boy sat curled on a crate of blankets, clutching a ragged toy. He looked up when he heard the footsteps. For a moment, the world reduced to a single heartbeat. Ricardo did not think about dignity or appearances. He moved toward the child as gently as someone lifting glass. Gabriel's eyes were large and wary, the kind of quiet that had learned to keep itself small. When Ricardo slid into a chair and reached out, the boy did not flee. He placed a cautious hand on Ricardo's sleeve and examined the man as if he could measure his truth by touch. "Gabriel," Ricardo whispered, and the boy said the name back. It was not a flood of recollection as much as a bloom of recognition, a shape remembered in the part of a child that remembers being held. The reunion that followed was not the cinematic scene Ricardo had pictured 1,000 times. It was smaller, messy, utterly human. Bruna arrived and sat down on a dust-scratched floor and put her hands in her hands. Gabriel pressed his face into her shoulder as if into a puzzle piece that had been missing. The homeless man, Eduardo, watched from the doorway, his jaw slack with a mixture of relief and something that looked like grief for all the months he had not known what he had done. They took him home that night. The drive back was quiet in that particular way where people are listening to the life of another person. The mansion suddenly was not a mausoleum anymore, but a place with a bed to sleep in, plates to fill, a bathtub to fill.
Gabriel sat at the table and ate slowly, as if testing whether food could be real. He slept and woke up in a bed that smelled like his parents', and for the first time in months, Ricardo watched a chest rise and fall, and allowed himself to believe that the long, small rhythms of ordinary life could return. But happiness does not soften every edge. A month after Gabriel's return, Ricardo sat at his desk scanning the police file he had been given. He had been careful, not reckless. He had been grateful to the institution that had returned a child, but he had felt a nagging curiosity, the kind that makes a man who built fortunes from systems ask whether systems had been honest with him. Documents that should have a paper trail had gaps. A name of an officer in a report did not appear on any registry. A hospital note had been stamped and then overwritten. When Ricardo pressed, an anonymous message arrived on his phone. Stop asking questions. Some sentences are better left unopened. He was not a man to be stopped by a threat. He hired a private investigator and handed over the documents. The investigator, careful and methodical, followed digital footprints, interviewed staff at the orphanage, cross-checked stamps and contacts. The findings began to harden into something ugly. Files tampered with, records removed, payments made to accounts that led to shell corporations. Someone had been very practiced at pretending things were official. Ricardo's trust cracked in places he did not expect. He drove back to the orphanage with a team and proper legal authorization, only to find a room emptied as if it had been swept clean in the night. Gabriel's crate of blankets was gone. The child himself was gone. The homeless man, Eduardo, had also vanished. It felt like being plunged backward into the old cold, but this time Ricardo would not be paralyzed by fear. The missing bracelet, nothing and everything, had become the first breadcrumb. Investigators found, in a trash bin behind the orphanage, a small brooch pinned to a tattered jacket. On the back of the brooch, under a smear of glue, were two tiny initials, R.M., Renata Morales, Ricardo's ex-wife. He had not wanted her to be more than a wound he had learned to live with. Now her initials sat on a brooch in a trash bin like a signature. The investigators pulled old custody files, financial transfers, and conversations pulled from backups. The picture that formed was not simple. Jealousy, a custody battle gone cold, a woman who had once wanted to control a life she could no longer share. When they confronted Renata, her composure was tight as a closed fist. She spoke in the clipped tone of someone who had practiced indignation. She insisted she had done nothing illegal. She suggested she had acted out of love. And in her face, Ricardo saw traces of a woman who had been replaced by wealth and stability she could no longer reach. It was not enough to confront Renata in a polite room with polite questions.
The investigators followed a thread of surveillance footage and bank transfers to an industrial area outside the city. One of the security clips showed a white van pulling into a warehouse yard at dawn. Later that day, the same van left with a tarp over its back. The raid happened after the sun had dropped and the air smelled like diesel. Investigators moved fast and hard. Inside a cold warehouse, under a stack of shipping pallets, they found a small cot, and, curled like a thing that had been put away for safety, Gabriel. Beside him, hoarse and thinner than Ricardo had first seen him, was Eduardo. The homeless man had scarred hands and a bandaged knee, but his eyes were the same, fierce and steady. The reunion in that warehouse was jagged with relief and anger. Gabriel clung to Ricardo as if to anchor him. Eduardo explained in short sentences, promises broken, paid caretakers who were not what they seemed, a plan that took a turn. Somewhere in the telling there was shame, not because he had recognized the child, but because he had not known enough to go to the right people right away. Renata was arrested on the spot along with an accomplice, one of the orphanage staff who had been complicit in forging documents and moving children through unofficial channels. The legal system, imperfect and slow, did its work in a way that felt painfully ordinary. Arraignments, hearings, a trial where the smallest betrayals were spread out like evidence under a light. The court listened to accounts of jealousy and fear, to testimony about money and manipulations. Renata received a sentence long enough that she could not contact Gabriel, and the court established a restraining order. It was not vengeance. It was law, trying to stitch back what had been pulled apart. In the months after the conviction, Gabriel went to therapy. The therapists were kind and patient and skilled in the small architecture of helping a child rebuild trust. He learned to sleep without a fear so close to the surface that noon could become evening. He learned to let his laughter come back in small increments. The house began to shift its furniture of absence for furniture of life. A painting hung on the wall. Friends came for dinner. A soccer ball left the back porch and went out into the yard. And Eduardo, who had begun as the ragged stranger at the gate, became something else. Ricardo had promised, in the way people make vows when they are overwhelmed with gratitude, that he would not forget the hand that had pointed to a photograph and altered the course of a life. He paid for Eduardo's legal fees when needed, enrolled him in a program that helped with housing, and most urgently, arranged medical care for Eduardo's mother, who had been sick and without means for years. The man who had lived under bridges was offered, with no sermon attached, a small apartment and a room in Ricardo's home where he could come and eat and feel welcomed. There were awkward moments.
Eduardo's world and Ricardo's did not fit together at first. He would arrive in muddy shoes and sit at the end of the table, watching how the family moved. Gabriel, at times, would demand that Eduardo tell the story of the sugar wafers as if it were a legend. Eduardo, who had sold sweetness to quiet hunger, learned to accept gifts without suspicion. Over time, the receipts of their lives began to balance out. Shared meals, visits with professionals who helped Eduardo find work that suited him, and a slow, mutual learning in dignity. Ricardo watched, sometimes in the small hours before dawn, as Gabriel played with Eduardo on the back lawn. He saw how the boy's laughter had returned with a different timbre, warmer, less fragile. He saw Eduardo teaching Gabriel how to kick a ball with his left foot, holding back so the child could succeed. He felt, in the space where grief had lived, a light that was not naive but steady. Not everything was neat. There were nights when old fears pressed against the door. There were reminders of how close the family had come to deeper loss, the threats that had shown up on Ricardo's phone, the moments when reporters asked intrusive questions, the bureaucratic delays in ensuring custody and therapy payments. But there was also a community that had stepped in, neighbors who brought casseroles, strangers who sent notes, investigators who refused to let the thread go slack. The final hearing left room for a small human moment that was not recorded in official transcripts, but lived in a memory all the same. Ricardo, standing in the courtroom, accepted that justice was not a miracle but a process that required persistence. He had learned to be patient with systems and impatient with lies. He had also learned gratitude in the form of responsibility. When the judge spoke of restitution and restrictions on contact, Ricardo simply let his hand rest on Gabriel's small shoulder. It was a promise enacted in touch. In time, the photograph on the foyer wall was moved to a lower position, not hidden but no longer the central altar of a house. There were new photographs, of a scraped knee with a bandage, of a birthday candle blown out too fast, of a soccer team where both Gabriel and Eduardo stood in mismatched jerseys. The mansion that had once been a museum of waiting became slowly a house of stitches and laughter. Ricardo never forgot where the rescue had begun. At family gatherings he would tell the story quietly, how a man who had no home pointed to a photograph and changed the course of their lives. In retelling, he never let the story be about him alone. He spoke of Eduardo's courage and the investigators' careful work. He called it sometimes the night the street decided to speak back. There was also a quieter legacy. Bruna, who had once been brittle with grief, found work at a community program that funded therapy for children from torn backgrounds.
She began to teach parents how to build rituals so that children could feel safe. She and Ricardo had conversations that did more than patch, they transformed. They learned to let themselves be imperfect and to ask for help without shame. Eduardo married stability to the hard lessons of the street. He kept the bracelet Gabriel had once worn, not as a talisman, but as a reminder that small things mattered. He wrote letters to people from his neighborhood who had found themselves invisible, telling them that sometimes the thing a person needed most was for someone else to speak up. Years later, on a hot summer afternoon, a neighbor came by and said, almost breathless, "Do you remember when you posted that old photo and a man at your gate asked whose son it was?" Ricardo laughed. "I remember everything," he said. They had learned that nothing about healing was instant. It was not the sudden return of normal so often promised in stories. It was the accumulation of meals, of appointments kept, of days when people showed up. It was the hard work of trust rebuilt in increments. It was also the way a single act, an observant man pointing to a photograph, could ripple outward and force the truth into light. There were other small scenes that mattered a great deal. Gabriel at his first soccer practice after the trial, afraid at first to be in a crowd. Eduardo showing Gabriel how to tie his shoes so they would not come undone during a race.
Bruna, sitting at the piano and actually finishing a song. Those were the quiet epics of recovery. When people asked Ricardo whether he had forgiven Renata, the answer was complicated. Forgiveness did not erase the choices that had been made or the harm that had been caused, but he had chosen not to let hatred be an inheritance for Gabriel. The court had done what it needed to. Ricardo had gathered his son into his life, chosen public restitution where it mattered, and ensured his child would not have to bear the shadow of revenge. The homeless man, Eduardo, never wanted to be hailed as a hero in a loud way. He accepted a life with access to healthcare, a small apartment near Gabriel's school, and the occasional odd job that allowed him to keep his hands useful. He was present at family dinners, and Gabriel would often ask him to tell the story of the sugar wafers, embellishing while Eduardo shook his head and laughed. In private, Ricardo would sometimes place a hand on Eduardo's shoulder and acknowledge what he had done without dramatizing it. "You saved him," Ricardo would say. Eduardo, who had been taught to make himself small, would simply nod. On the first anniversary of Gabriel's return, the family gathered in the backyard. Neighbors, investigators turned friends, therapists who had watched a little boy's steps back to safety. People came bearing food and presents. Gabriel blew out a single candle and wished, in a child's simple way, that everyone who had helped him be happy.
As the afternoon folded into evening, Ricardo walked to the wall in the foyer and looked at the photograph that had once been the axis of his grief. He touched the frame, then turned away to join the people gathered in his yard. He had learned to live with the photograph not as a wound, but as a line in a story with many other lines: loss, rescue, corruption exposed, justice delivered, lives remade. He also learned to speak plainly when people asked him how the world had shifted. "A boy from the street sold me hope," he would say, and the sentence was true and incomplete in the best possible way. It held both the literal, how Eduardo had recognized Gabriel, and the vast human truth that the world is often rescued by those we least expect. If this story moved you, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what part touched you most. Subscribe for more stories that remind us how ordinary courage can change everything.